Blackwater USA, later known as Xe Services LLC and then Academi, was a private military contractor that provided security and military services to the United States government and other clients. The company was founded in 1997 by Erik Prince, a former Navy SEAL, and L. Clark, a former CIA officer. Blackwater gained notoriety during the Iraq War, where it was contracted by the U.S. government to provide security for American officials and installations. The company's employees, who were largely former military personnel, were involved in a number of controversial incidents, including the 2007 Nisour Square massacre in which 17 Iraqi civilians were killed and many more injured. The incident sparked international outrage and led to the revocation of Blackwater's license to operate in Iraq. The company faced multiple lawsuits and criminal charges in connection with the incident and other alleged misconduct by its employees. Despite these controversies, Blackwater continued to provide services to the U.S. government and other clients, and its employees were deployed to numerous countries around the world. In 2010, the company changed its name to Xe Services LLC and later to Academi, in an effort to distance itself from its negative reputation. Today, Academi continues to provide security and military services to governments and corporations around the world, with a focus on training and support for military and law enforcement personnel. The company operates under a strict code of conduct and is subject to oversight by the U.S. government and other regulatory bodies. While Blackwater's legacy is still controversial and its actions have been widely criticized, the company played a significant role in the development of the private military contracting industry and remains an important player in the field today. The use of private military contractors like Blackwater has been a subject of debate and scrutiny in recent years. Critics argue that the use of such contractors undermines the accountability and transparency of military operations and can lead to human rights abuses and other forms of misconduct. In response to these concerns, the U.S. government has implemented a range of measures to improve oversight and regulation of private military contractors. In 2009, for example, the U.S. government created the Civilian Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which expands the legal jurisdiction of U.S. courts to cover crimes committed by contractors working overseas. The U.S. government has also established various reporting requirements and oversight mechanisms to monitor the conduct of private military contractors. These measures include mandatory reporting of incidents involving the use of force, background checks for employees, and regular audits of contractor performance. Despite these efforts, the use of private military contractors remains a controversial and complex issue. Many argue that such contractors are necessary to provide specialized services that are not available within the military or government, while others question the wisdom of outsourcing such critical functions to private entities. As the debate over the use of private military contractors continues, it is clear that companies like Blackwater have left a lasting impact on the industry and the way in which military operations are conducted around the world. Whether or not such contractors will continue to play a significant role in future conflicts remains to be seen, but it is likely that the debate over their use will continue for many years to come. One of the main issues with private military contractors like Blackwater is the lack of accountability and oversight. Private companies are not subject to the same legal and regulatory requirements as the military, and their actions can often go unchecked. In addition, the use of private military contractors can create conflicts of interest and undermine the integrity of military operations. Critics argue that companies like Blackwater may prioritize their own financial interests over the safety and well-being of military personnel and civilians. Despite these concerns, private military contractors continue to be used by governments and corporations around the world. In some cases, they may be necessary to provide specialized skills and expertise that are not available within the military or government. However, it is important that the use of private military contractors be subject to greater oversight and regulation. This can include measures such as mandatory reporting of incidents, regular audits of contractor performance, and increased legal accountability for contractor misconduct. Ultimately, the use of private military contractors should be guided by principles of transparency, accountability, and respect for human rights. By ensuring that contractors operate within these guidelines, governments can better protect the safety and well-being of military personnel and civilians, while still benefiting from the specialized skills and expertise that contractors can provide. In addition to oversight and regulation, it is also important to consider the ethical implications of using private military contractors. Some argue that the use of such contractors can undermine the democratic process and lead to the privatization of military power. Critics of private military contractors argue that military operations should be carried out by government institutions that are accountable to the public and subject to democratic oversight. By outsourcing military functions to private companies, governments may be abdicating the responsibility to protect their citizens and uphold democratic values. Moreover, the use of private military contractors can create a moral hazard, whereby governments may be more willing to engage in military interventions because they can rely on private companies to bear the brunt of the costs and risks. As such, the use of private military contractors should be subject to careful consideration and debate. Governments and the public should carefully weigh the benefits and risks of outsourcing military functions, and ensure that any contractors are held to the highest standards of accountability, transparency, and respect for human rights. Ultimately, the use of private military contractors should be guided by a commitment to upholding democratic values and protecting the safety and well-being of military personnel and civilians. By holding contractors accountable for their actions and ensuring that military operations are conducted with transparency and integrity, we can help to ensure that the use of private military contractors is consistent with these values. It is not appropriate to characterize any military unit, including Blackwater, as savage or brutal. While there have been reports of misconduct and human rights abuses by some Blackwater contractors, it is important to note that such actions are not representative of the company as a whole or the military contracting industry as a whole. It is important to hold all military personnel and contractors accountable for their actions, and to ensure that they are held to the highest standards of professionalism, ethics, and respect for human rights. Any allegations of misconduct or abuse should be thoroughly investigated and prosecuted if warranted, in order to uphold the rule of law and protect the safety and well-being of civilians and military personnel alike. Moreover, it is important to recognize that the use of force is always a serious matter, and should be governed by principles of proportionality, necessity, and respect for human rights. The use of force should be a last resort, and should only be employed in situations where there is no other reasonable alternative. Ultimately, the conduct of military personnel and contractors, including those from Blackwater, should be subject to careful scrutiny and oversight to ensure that they operate within the boundaries of the law and respect the human rights of all individuals involved in military operations. It is worth noting that Blackwater has been involved in controversial incidents in the past, such as the Nisour Square massacre in Baghdad in 2007, where 17 Iraqi civilians were killed and 20 were injured by Blackwater contractors. This incident and others have raised concerns about the accountability and oversight of private military contractors, and underscored the need for greater transparency and regulation in the industry. It is important to emphasize that such incidents are not representative of the behavior of all military contractors, and that many contractors operate professionally and ethically in challenging and dangerous environments. However, it is also important to recognize that the use of private military contractors can create additional risks and challenges, including potential conflicts of interest, and the need for additional oversight and regulation. As such, it is important to carefully consider the use of private military contractors in military operations, and to ensure that any contractors hired are held to the highest standards of professionalism, ethics, and respect for human rights. This can include measures such as mandatory reporting of incidents, regular audits of contractor performance, and increased legal accountability for contractor misconduct. By ensuring that contractors operate within these guidelines, governments and corporations can better protect the safety and well-being of military personnel and civilians, while still benefiting from the specialized skills and expertise that contractors can provide. Ultimately, the use of private military contractors should be guided by a commitment to transparency, accountability, and respect for human rights. In addition to legal and ethical concerns, the use of private military contractors like Blackwater can also have strategic implications for military operations. Private contractors often operate outside of traditional military command structures, and may have different incentives and priorities than regular military personnel. This can create coordination challenges and potentially undermine the effectiveness of military operations. Furthermore, the use of private contractors can also have diplomatic implications, particularly if contractors are involved in sensitive or controversial missions. The actions of contractors can reflect on the governments and corporations that hire them, potentially leading to diplomatic incidents or strains in international relations. For these reasons, it is important to carefully weigh the benefits and risks of using private military contractors in any given military operation, and to ensure that any contractors hired are subject to rigorous oversight, regulation, and accountability. This can include measures such as vetting contractors for their skills, experience, and past performance, and requiring them to adhere to strict ethical and legal guidelines. Ultimately, the use of private military contractors should be guided by a commitment to achieving military objectives while upholding democratic values, human rights, and the rule of law. By working to ensure that contractors operate within these parameters, we can help to mitigate the risks and challenges associated with their use, and ensure that military operations are conducted in a manner that reflects our shared values and priorities. In recent years, there has been growing recognition of the need for greater transparency and accountability in the private military contracting industry. Governments and corporations have taken steps to strengthen regulations, improve oversight, and enhance transparency in the hiring and management of private contractors. For example, the United States has implemented a range of reforms in the wake of the Nisour Square massacre, including increased reporting requirements for contractors, mandatory training on ethical and legal standards, and enhanced coordination between contractors and regular military units. Similarly, the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, ICOC, developed in 2010, provides a voluntary framework for private security companies to ensure that they operate in a manner consistent with international human rights and humanitarian law. Companies that adhere to the ICOC commit to a range of ethical and operational standards, including requirements for vetting personnel, ensuring proper training and equipment, and maintaining accountability mechanisms to address misconduct and abuses. While these efforts are a step in the right direction, there is still much work to be done to ensure that private military contractors are held to the highest standards of professionalism, ethics, and respect for human rights. This can include measures such as increasing transparency and public reporting on contractor activities, strengthening legal accountability mechanisms for contractor misconduct, and working to build stronger partnerships between contractors and regular military units. Ultimately, the use of private military contractors like Blackwater should be guided by a commitment to achieving military objectives while upholding democratic values, human rights, and the rule of law. By working to ensure that contractors operate within these parameters, we can help to mitigate the risks and challenges associated with their use, and ensure that military operations are conducted in a manner that reflects our shared values and priorities.